Hello everyone and welcome back to the garage. I'm actually in the car right now because I said it's a lovely morning. It's about 4:30 a.m. and I've driven down to the lake to record some of the voiceovers, and look at that lovely view. It's quite nice and no one's around. It's just me and the ducks. So yeah, I can do a bit of work in peace. But back to the point, as you've seen in the title, in this video I'm going to rebuild the front forks. Let's get to it. So I'm going to start with the forks now, and the first thing I want to do before I take them apart is give them a clean, obviously. They are a bit cruddy. I did wash the bike before I brought it in the garage, but they still have some debris and crud built left on them. And especially in this area, when I took them out of the stanchions, there are a lot of deposits on here. They're quite thick. And I really want to get this area clean, because when I slide the new seals over it, it might actually damage the lip of the seal. So in order to save time and not make this too boring, we're just going to speed through the disassembly process. I'm just going to loosen the bottom bolt that holds the damper in place now while the fork is assembled, so there's a bit of tension on it and I've got a better chance of getting it loose. Now taking the top cap off, but it's worth mentioning if you haven't seen my previous video, I've loosened these while they were still clamped in the bike. Apologies for the background noise, I forgot to turn off the heater, and yes, even though this video is posted in the summer, the actual work was done sometime in the winter. There we go, here comes the spring out, and I can pour out that lovely smelling oil. So I'm just using a damper bleeding tool to move the damper in and out so it spits out some more of that old oil. And all this tool is, it's a rod with threads on both ends, so you can just thread it on top of the damper and pull it in and out. So remove the bottom bolt and the whole damper assembly should come out. Gently pry the dust seal off, but I'm making sure I don't put too much pressure to damage the fork leg. There's a snap ring in there that needs to be removed, and that's good to know before I start trying to hammer the seals out. A few taps and it all comes apart. Look at that. The oil is pretty nasty, but the actual fork internals are in pretty good condition. Give everything another good clean before reassembly, and I only just realized how messy my bench looks. I should have been a bit tidier as I was filming. Right, so it's reassembly time. Since I've used brake cleaner on all the parts, they're a bit dry, so I'm just going to lightly oil the bearings before I put the stanchion back in the fork leg. And now the top bearing goes in. washer or spacer. I'm going to go ahead and put the damper assembly in. Install the bottom bolt with a new seal, and I'm just going to nip it up, but we are going to torque this up later when it's all assembled. Now I'm just going to oil the seals before I install them to make it easier to assemble and also to minimize the risk of damaging them. Now the top of the stanchion has a few sharp edges, which should be covered before you try to put the seal on. You may get away with it, as I have done in the past on my own bikes, but it's not necessarily a good idea to just pull the seal over without any protection. So there are various ways of doing this. There's special tools for it as well if you want to buy them, but I find most of the time electrical tape or a plastic bag works just fine. A bit of oil and I can slide the seals over it safely. I'm going to push it down with my fingers as far as I can and get it lined up. And then I'm going to use my fork seal tool to drive it in the rest of the way. Once it's driven all the way home, we can install the snap ring. And if the seal hasn't bottomed out properly, the snap ring may not go in place. And there we go, that's snapped in place lovely. And now it's time to install the dust seal. Same process, get it lined up, and then use the fork seal tool to hammer it in the rest of the way. Now it's time to put the spring back in. The taper end goes in first as it's sitting on the flange fixed to the damper rod. So here we are, getting close to finishing this. I've got both fork legs here, all reassembled. I'm ready to fill them with oil, adjust the air gap, and put them back in the bike. Let's go for it. So I'm going to attempt to torque the bottom bolts now, but this doesn't always work. Sometimes you need the fork all reassembled, so the spring is pushing down on the damper rod to stop it from spinning. But in this case, it worked just fine. So the manual gives you an amount of oil per fork leg, but also gives you an air gap. And usually the air gap is more important than the actual amount of oil. So the manual asks for 586 cc, and what I'm going to do is just fill in 600 cc in each fork leg, prime the damper rod, and then set the air gap correctly. There's always something very satisfying about pouring fresh clean oil. It makes the job worthwhile. That's why I'm going to make you watch the whole thing. Now I'm going to bleed the damper rods to make sure all the air is out and replaced by oil, because otherwise, when I set the air gap, if I bleed the damper rods after, the oil level might drop a bit. And there we go. As soon as I see oil pouring out between the tool and the damper rod, there's a little slot in the threads. That's when I know the rod should be bled and full of oil. And now I'm going to set the 78mm air gap. And that's 78mm with the fork stanchion bottom out fully compressed and the spring in place also, because that raises the oil level a bit. So yeah, I've got my gauge set to the right level, and now I'm just going to use the syringe to suck the excess oil out. Good, now that the oil level is set correctly, it's time to finish the job. So I'm going to start by reinstalling the damper rod tool. You'll see in a bit why. Washer goes in place on top of the spring. Spacer. Then the other washer. And now I'm using the tool to lift the damper rod up so I can install the C-washer and lock it in place. So I've done the other fork leg as well, and now I can install the top caps with the preload and damping adjustments. Thread it in till I hit the lock nut and then lock it. Now I was careful not to change the position of that lock nut. It's where it was originally on both fork legs, because if you move that up and down, it will change the preload on the spring. Not a big deal, because you can adjust it from top if you feel it's not right, but it's a good idea to keep them in the same position. Tighten them up so they don't go anywhere. Now pull the stanchions all the way up, press the cap down and compress the springs, and start spinning it to carefully engage the threads. Be careful not to cross thread it though. And I'm just going to screw the cap in till it bottoms out, but I will torque it to spec later when it's clamped back in the bike. And that's it. Forks are all done, ready to go back in the bike. So in the next video we're going to do the front wheel bearings probably, and then start putting things back together. So thanks for watching and see you next time.